The virus hit, and the government started to invoke civil processes in the law against the people. Limitations and restrictions were put in place to a considerable degree. Agents of the government then started to show up at the churches and mosques, trying to enforce these civil restrictions on these bodies, on the pastors, and on the imams. You cannot have more than 50 members in the church or in the mosque at once. You must wear a mask. Hey, you must distance from one another. Now we are ordering you to close the building, among many other restrictions. Many leaders who tried to stand up against what was transpiring found themselves arrested and facing civil fines and punishments, or criminal punishments, for their resistance. The agents of the government would show up to the buildings, accompanied usually by 2 police officers or more, and the pretense was that they were coming there to enforce civil procedure, to enforce civil laws, to enforce the civil mandate upon the pastor or upon the imam and upon the members of the congregation. There were many videos put out at that time on YouTube, and we saw that Christian pastors were trying to stand up to what was going on, and they were being arrested and they were being charged. Or the imams in the mosques also, they were being arrested and being charged. The agents of the government would show up to the buildings stating they have a civil order. You can't have service in the building no more. Well, you can have service in the parking lot in your car if you're isolated in your car, but you can't come into the building and you can't hold service in the building no more. Well, why not? Well, we have a civil order. We have a civil order that states you cannot have more than 25 or 50 or 100 persons in the building at any given time. We have a civil order that everyone must wear a mask. There were many restrictions placed against the religious organizations through the civil laws, through the civil mandate that was given force of law. These agents, they would just show up at the church buildings or at the mosques, just walk onto the property, walk into the building and say, let me speak to the leader here. Let me speak to the imam, or let me speak to the pastor. And they would threaten them with arrest or with a fine for not submitting to the civil process, to the civil law that they were there to enforce. As a minister of the gospel, or as an imam, as an officiant, there are laws in place that protect you and I from all interference under civil law from the agents of the government. This protection is afforded to us as primary law, as a foundational law, as a law of the land, as a human right. The Criminal Code of Canada, Article 176. Every person is guilty of an indictable offense and liable to imprisonment for a term of not more than 2 years, or is guilty of an offense punishable on summary conviction who, by threats or force, unlawfully obstructs or prevents or endeavors to obstruct or prevent an officiant, a pastor, an imam, from celebrating a religious or spiritual service or performing any other function in connection with their calling, or knowing that an officiant is about to perform, is on their way to perform, or is returning from the performance of any of the duties or functions mentioned in paragraph A, assaults or offers any violence to them, or arrests them on a civil process, or under the pretense of executing a civil process. When the agents of the government came to the churches and came to the mosques, their presence there was under the pretense of enforcing or executing a civil process, a civil mandate, a civil law. They would say, we are here to enforce the government mandate. we are here under a civil process. The actions of the agents unlawfully obstructed or completely prevented the leaders from holding the service. They have no authority of law. It is unlawful for them to come and interfere with you when you are holding your service under the pretense of their trying to enforce a civil process against you. If the pastor or imam refuse to obey and to conform to the civil process, then they would arrest the man under the pretense that the pastor or the imam was breaking the civil law, was breaking the civil order. They would arrest them and force them to close down the church building or to close down the mosque, claiming that they had this authority because they were exercising the government mandate. They were executing a civil process. When the law clearly says that no one has the right to interfere with an officiant under the pretense of a civil law, under the pretense of a civil mandate, but they did it anyways. The agents were and are guilty of unlawfully obstructing. The unlawful obstruction is and was that what they were doing was trying to enforce a civil process upon the pastor or the imam. These agents that showed up at the church or the mosque doors were well aware that these leaders were about to celebrate a religious or a spiritual service, and that the pastor or the imam was performing functions in connection with their calling. So it was unlawful for them to come there and to say, we have a civil mandate and we're going to obstruct you from performing your duties. Article 176, Section B says, knowing that an officiant is about to perform, is on their way to perform, or is returning from the performance of any of the duties or functions mentioned in paragraph A. So just showing up on the church or mosque property prior to the service starting or during a service means that they knew that the pastor or the imam was about to perform or was already performing. They would then use threats and sometimes force upon these men to get them to conform to the civil orders. They would arrest the pastor or the imam if the leaders refused to close down the church or the mosque. The government agent's position would be that they were there exercising a civil process, exercising a civil order. And since the pastor or the imam was refusing, they would then place them under arrest for failure to comply. The whole interaction of these agents and the police officers were unlawful. In fact, these agents and these officers in law were guilty of an indictable offense. They were threatening pastors and threatening imams to comply with the civil order by threatening to arrest them for failure to obey the civil mandate that they were there to enforce. However, the law says that if these agents use threat or force, unlawfully obstructs, or prevents or tries to prevent a pastor or an imam from celebrating a religious or spiritual service, or stops the leaders from performing any function in connection with his calling because they are there trying to enforce a civil law or a civil process on the pastor or on the imam, then they are the ones who become guilty of an offense. Every person is guilty of an indictable offense. The government agents are guilty of an indictable offense. The police officers accompanying those agents are guilty of an indictable offense if they unlawfully obstruct or prevent or endeavor to prevent an officiant from celebrating a religious or spiritual service, or performing any function in connection with their calling, or if they know that the pastor or the imam is about to perform, is on their way to perform, or is returning from the performance of any of their duties, and they interfere with them and they obstruct them by trying to arrest them on a civil process or under the pretense of executing a civil process, a civil mandate, then they are guilty of an indictable offense for doing so. This law has broad applications, and it functions against all and anything that arises from statutory law, from civil mandates. The Criminal Code of Canada, Article 176, everyone who willfully disturbs or interrupts an assemblage of persons meant for religious worship is guilty of an offense punishable on summary conviction. The Criminal Code restricts and disallows the government agents from stopping a pastor or an imam from having service, from holding services, under the pretense that these pastors or these imams are breaking the civil law. If the agents of the government persist on attempting to prevent a pastor or imam from celebrating his divine service, then they are also guilty of willfully disrupting and interrupting the assemblage of persons. Many of the pastors and many of the imams which suffered arrest subsequently went and hired a lawyer to try and defend against the charges that were laid against them. You have the Christian Association of Lawyers, thousands of lawyers that belong to this association, and none of them could argue the correct argument in court. These lawyers brought these people into the courts under Section 2 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, claiming that there had been a violation under Section 2 of the Charter. And as most of my subscribers are aware, going to court under Article 2 is a no-win situation. All the freedoms listed in Section 2 of the Charter are allowed to be limited and abridged in a time of public emergency, in a time of medical emergency. They wasted thousands of dollars in court to try and bring this argument forward to the court, claiming that they violated Section 2 of the Charter. That need not be done. You only needed to stand under your claim of right. You only needed to stand under the Criminal Code of Canada in order to beat those charges. Based upon foundational law, based upon the common law, what should have transpired is that a charge under the Criminal Code of Canada should have been laid against the government agents and the police officers who enforced the civil mandate with those agents against the pastors and the imams. In this situation, these leaders should have had a claim of recognition in place. A proper claim of recognition would have produced a lawful excuse against the civil orders. The principles of justice contained in the claim of recognition would have trumped any civil order that they were being threatened with. Further to this, the claim of recognition would have ousted the justice's jurisdiction in the matter, as it pertains to the charges laid against the pastor or the imam. This was the way to protect oneself and one's religious organization. You lawyers, you should have brought forth the exemption and the proviso applied or qualified in the Criminal Code of Canada to defeat all charges against the pastors and the imams. And subsequent to that, you should have laid a charge against the government agents for what they did. There was a lawful excuse to the charges, because the charges that were rendered against the pastors and the imams, they were rendered under the pretext of enforcing a civil order or a civil mandate. And the rights of the pastor and the rights of the imam, they trump those civil orders. And once the lawful excuse was brought forth, then a subsequent charge should have been levied against the agents of the government. That's how to defend against that. But instead, you charge these men thousands of dollars to bring them into a court of law to invoke Article 2 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, when most of you probably knew already that those rights or those freedoms could be limited and abridged in a time of public emergency. And along those lines, right, many individuals felt like they were forced to take a jab, contrary to what they wanted to do. Again, a proper claim of recognition being stood upon would have ousted the authority of the civil mandate. The civil mandate only applied against the statutory creature, but more specifically in this context, it was the resident. The claim of recognition would have removed your standing as resident and caused you to stand before the state party under your full legal capacity, thereby owing no duty to the civil order. And any charge or penalty imposed upon an individual for failure to comply with the civil mandate would have lost its force or effect. There is a round 2 that is about to play out, and this round 2 is going to be a lot worse than round number 1 was. And the things they're going to try and force the people to do, it's almost going to be scary if you don't know how to defend yourself. So if you're a pastor or an imam, or if you're a Christian lawyer that represented one of these pastors and you come across this video, well, it's an expedient action for you to get a claim of recognition in play for all these men and all these women who are going to be affronted by what's coming in round number 2.